Okay, part two of chapter 11. Our baby is born, and now we're going to walk through what amounts to, I think, the first year of the neonate's life, which is referred to generally as infancy. One of the factors that contributes to the what we would call an at-risk newborn involves birth weight, and that really a low birth weight it can really result in profound long-term effects on the child and the family, and this problem sometimes can be very costly. The estimates are about $26 billion per year in the United States alone because of issues regarding prematurity. The rate of these late-term preterm births has increased by 25% since the 1990s. Children or neonates who are born early are at risk for respiratory distress and have a threefold greater chance of dying than a full-term infant does. There are a number of different severities of low birth weight that's mentioned in the textbook, and I'm not going to go into them specifically, but just suffice to say, it goes from a low birth weight to extremely low birth weights, and each of those stages create additional problems for the neonate potentially. And the most severe, those born with the lowest of birth weights, and sometimes below 2 pounds or 2 to 4 pounds, those kinds of things oftentimes can result in neurological and psychological and physical problems, the list of which is only partial but includes things like cerebral palsy, blindness, deafness, cognitive delays, and feeding intolerance. So this is an issue that really is something that's very important at the time of birth. Also, congenital abnormalities or anomalies also contribute to problems related to neonates. And a congenital anomaly is any medical condition that occurs at or before birth. Sometimes we call them birth defects, and there's 4 general categories for them that relate to either the inheritance of a single abnormal gene or a number of genes, multiple genes that are interacting and create a genetic expression that varies from what is considered to be typical or normal. Chromosomal aberrations, which isn't a genetic thing, but there's some sort of mishap that happens during the development of the ovum or sperm cells, and also exposure to teratogens, which we had talked about in the previous part of this chapter. Most newborns, at the time of birth, a full-term baby weighs between 5 and 10 pounds. Some are smaller, some are larger. And during the course of the first year, it can be anticipated that they will triple their birth weight. And infant nutrition is very important, and it has an impact upon brain development and physical stature and motor skill development, and really almost any stage of development for that matter. So really, where that baby is born, the culture, is the one that has a lot of resources available or not, is something that's very important. The World Health Organization's Multi-Center Growth Reference Study, the MGRS, is used to construct standards to assess the development of children and their development and their growth from infancy through 5 years of age. And I think, this is the scale are very similar to the scale that pediatricians use in assessing child's development and growth, whether they're up to where they should be or not. And there are certainly ethnic differences in infant growth that have been observed as well. And the WHO's study that developed this somehow or other kind of standardized this across many different cultures. So it's considered to be a pretty good reference for determining whether the child is at that percentile where the child should be or not. And I think this text says, or perhaps I was reading in the, it might have been that I was reading in the website for the WHO, the MGRS. It says that it's important for parents to understand, even with a child that is at the the one percentile in any particular developmental thing is still within the normal range. It is when they're below that one percentile that they become abnormal. So it's something to help parents. Very small babies or babies that are developing slowly in some areas are still very much within normal range, even though they're at a low percentile in the overall scale. Self-regulation is another issue for infant development, and as we mentioned, I think in the last chapter, there's certain things that, like temperature control and those kinds of things that the infant, the neonate, has to regulate, to begin to regulate almost immediately. Sleeping, eating, eliminating are all issues that anyone who's had a newborn in their home knows. This is something that can disrupt the parent's sleep cycle and just kind of the whole day kind of gets upended sometimes in trying to deal with a newborn's sleep cycle and eating cycle and those kinds of things. And as the newborn gets older, I think it's around 3 months or so, it will tell us that generally speaking, the infant typically, I should say, begins to adjust to the parent's schedule. And again, there are cultural variations, and not without controversy, by the way, for the way caregivers go about shaping sleeping and eating behaviors of infant. One of the things that's mentioned in the text that is something that's routine in most cultures, where the infant sleeps with the parent, is called co-sleeping, has been associated and is really discouraged in the United States because it's been associated with the increased risk of sudden infant death syndrome in the United States, I think in the first 12 weeks of life or something like this. There's also been concern that we have we see this in child protective services from time to time, sadly, what's called a rollover death, where the infant is sleeping with the parent and the parent rolls over at night and the infant isn't able to call attention to the fact that it's being smothered, and so there has been some pretty active discouragement from in the United States from parents using co-sleeping. Also, there's discussion, and this has been going on since long before my life started, about whether to respond to a crying and fussing baby. Some of it's cultural, some of it's got something to do with the educational trends, that young parents deal with. Like we said earlier, they're flooded with all sorts of advice and information and recommendations. Parents have to kind of sort through all that and figure out how to go about soothing infants, when to soothe them and when to leave them be. The sensory system also is activating and developing during this period of time: sight, taste, smell, touch, pain. The text says, the infant's ability to hear is for typical infants, those that don't have that aren't born deaf, that is the earliest link to the environment. And around 4 months of age or so, infants' vision has become pretty much the same as an adult's vision, but prior to that time, there's a lot of fuzziness, and it's not very clear, typically with infants. But at somewhere around 3 months of age, they can begin to distinguish the parent's face from other person's faces, and will begin to respond differently to parents. Tastes, they can differentiate, in newborns at practically at birth, I guess, between sweetness and bitterness, sourness, and of course from the very first day of life, babies can feel pain. Touch, in and of itself, is mentioned as a very vital part of infant development, and there are different ways that infants soothe, cultures soothe. Some cultures use the swaddling method, and where you wrap the baby in the blanket or the whatever it is that you have, and this is something that's become, I think, more popular in the United States in the last few decades. Once again, whereas other individuals, rock and talk to the baby gently and cuddle the baby and that kind of thing in order to soothe. But it's stated that skin-to-skin contact between parents and infants has been found to have benefits for both parents and child. Reflexes are the involuntary muscle responses to certain stimuli, and infants are born with two critical reflexes. That's rooting and sucking. Rooting is that reflex that when the cheek is touched, to turn towards that touch. And of course, that could be a finger, it could be a breast. And so you can kind of see how that becomes pretty important in the development of the infant, instinctually speaking. It really is a survival instinct, so to speak, as well as the sucking reflex as well. Now, it's around 2 to 4 weeks, both of these reflexes begin to disappear, and it's pointed out that if they don't disappear after that period of time, again, you have to be, it's not necessarily a timeline that is concrete, but around that period of time, if those reflexes don't disappear, they could be a sign of damage to the brain or the nervous system. The infant learning programs that exist around the state, are very important for parents with young children and help them use all these kinds of things to help them assess whether or not they're developing normally. And the earlier we identify any kind of damage or disability, let's say, that might exist, the sooner the parents and the professionals can begin to work on, on either compensating for it or working around it, whatever it might be. And so involvement, assessments with the infant learning program is something we really want to encourage parents to follow up with, even if the baby appears to be perfectly normal in so many ways. There are other reflexes that appear later. There's a chart in the text that kind of tells you when they appear, when they disappear. Some of those stay with us for the rest of their life, but some of those that don't include the startle reflex, for instance, in the infant, stepping, walking, grasping, those kinds of things. Motor skills, pretty predictable in terms of how they develop, and again, there's a normal range here. Somewhere in the text talks about using the term typical as opposed to normal, because children do develop outside typical ranges, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. It could be that the child is just slow to develop in certain areas, and sometimes children will develop very rapidly in some areas and be slow to develop in other areas. Again, that's also typical of growth in adolescence and the later on. In obtaining skills and those kinds of things. And so these are just kind of guides more than anything else. But you'll see, and this, as this points out, cultures also have an influence on motor development as well. But here you'll see what is typical as far as development for a lot of the motor, that what we call them the milestones, in developmental milestones when you do social histories. When did they start walking, talking? Well, talking is not included in this, so when they sit without support, those kinds of things. Brain development, of course, is a very important thing going on during this period of time, and the synapses have really accelerated quite a bit during the third trimester of pregnancy, the development of synapses in the brain. We talked about plasticity in a previous chapter, I believe, but the brain changes throughout our life and also changes in response to the experiences that the brain has. It's really shaped by experience, and so even at times when there are insults to the brain, so to speak, that sometimes synapses can regenerate in other directions or whatever, and the brain can compensate for problems that come up. That's what that plasticity is all about. And again, it used to be that we think that, that if the brain was damaged, that was it, but now we know better. But generally speaking, I like this phrase, what is used gets stronger, what's not used gets pruned. So, we want to make sure that we provide the infant with a lot of physical and psychological experiences that activate the brain and stimulate brain activity. Now, at the same time, while you look at those positive ways to activate the child's brain, you also have to consider some of the negatives, and persistent stress in the environment around the child has been found to result in the overdevelopment of areas of the brain associated with anxiety and fear. Very much so, the infant mirrors the emotional makeup or the emotional functioning of the parent, the primary caregiver. And so if you have a mother, for instance, with a high level of stress during while she's raising this infant, the infant's going to in some ways absorb that and respond in a similar way. And not only does it overdevelop areas of the brain associated with anxiety and fear, but also the frontal cortex, which is associated with logic, intelligence, also underdevelops in stressful environments. And there will be more about this later on, but this is particularly important to consider when you come into contact, as you will in this profession, come into contact with families where domestic violence exists. Brain mapping has shown that infants, even in a room or two removed from where violent activity is going on, the brain develops differently. The brain is impacted by the stress in the next room. And this is one of those things in child protection where workers a lot of time would say, well, they wouldn't have been impacted by the domestic violence because they didn't observe it, especially for infants, because, it's believed that they don't have an ability to understand, things that are going on outside their immediate environment. Well, PET studies and other kinds of things have demonstrated differently. There are studies that show that changes in the brains of pediatric populations who are exposed to violence are pretty common. And these are physical changes in the brain, you understand. So again, that impacts a lot of, consider for instance, a child that has an overactive fight or flight response center sitting in a classroom trying to absorb. Now again, we're jumping a couple life stages ahead here, but I mean, trying to absorb information coming to them from the teacher, which involves the prefrontal cortex in processing all of this. And so why do children in stressful environments have difficulty functioning in an academic setting, in a calm setting? This begins to suggest the reasons for that. The world of these children centers on survival, as this says, and it's based more in the primitive brain and doesn't really engage much in the higher functioning cognitive brain areas. It's true for infants as well. So in cognitive development, here we have Piaget's sensory motor stage developed into 4 substages, and you can see again just the gradual development of the infant's ability, the cognitive abilities of the infant in that first stage, which really is all about feeling and movement and senses and things like that. By stage 4, the infant is beginning to get a sense of object permanence and can begin to experience both stranger anxiety and separation anxiety when removed from persons who they depend upon. Language development begins somewhere around 2 months of age. By 4 months, infants are beginning to babble. Well, later on, when the text talks about play, they also say that some of that babbling is play. But there is some early language development in their babbling. And by 8 to 12 months, they begin to make gestures to indicate what they want. So what can adults do to help? Read to the child, talk to the child, interact with the infant. The more that goes on, the more all those synapses are going to be developed and activated in the language centers of the brain. And it's interesting here, I just had to throw this into this. I remember a little girl. It was one of the guys that I supervised back in Orlando, back in Florida, who was, his own roots were Cuban. Although he was born in America, his parents were Cuban. And he was raised bilingual, and his wife was, Ohio, Indiana, kind of a Midwestern Caucasian person, and their little girl, who was 2 years old maybe or something like that, when he would hold up a glass of water, he would say, "What is this?" And she'd say, "Water, agua." She had both words, and it was really fascinating, And they say the earlier you learn a language, the more fluent you're going to be with that, And so here this says that infants exposed to 2 languages, it's really remarkable that they learn both languages at the same rate that a monolingual infant would learn 1 language. Erickson's theory a little bit about psychosocial development. Of course, this is the beginning of the trust versus mistrust stage. And so, there's a lot of stuff about attachment and how the outside world is responding to the infant. Infants who demonstrate greater emotional regulation will have parents who use higher levels of positive parenting behaviors. Think about that a minute. That That's not surprising. I mean, if you've been around a fussy infant, colicky, I think is the term that is used, where that no matter what the mom does, it just seems that that infant just continues to cry and cry and cry. It's very easy to understand how parents can become stressed in those situations. The parent isn't getting back from the infant what they're giving to the infant, and although that's we can't expect, a parent doesn't expect a mutual exchange. Nonetheless, we all need some positive reinforcement in what we're doing, and when all her efforts are to not, then it's pretty tough for a parent to describe the parenting experience as positive, and that's going to have an effect on the child, certainly. But a child who has better emotional regulations is going to just have more positive experiences with their parent. If you run into parents with, difficult babies, please make sure that somehow there's a respite, that parent can get a break sometimes, even if it's daycare or friends coming over or something, but allow the parent the opportunity to get away and to relax a little. Temperament is in what's considered the innate disposition of the individual. And the text says, there's a lot of theories that say that this is really set very early in the infant's life, although that is still being researched. But there is some evidence of a genetic involvement in temperament. But it's important to keep in mind that interactions with caregivers over the months and years during infancy can have some ability to modify what appears to be a temperament that the infant is prone towards. Attachment's a big issue in this period, and there are a lot of psychological disorders that will tell you that there were problems that go back to early attachment difficulties. And this is the ability to form emotional bonds with other people. Now, it is a natural thing, of course, because it's a survival thing. It's sort of like the rooting and sucking reflex. If an infant doesn't attach to a caregiver, it's going to make it more difficult for the infant to have his or her needs satisfied, and so it's a natural tendency to attach, all things being equal. Now, attachment to the mother is generally, we're talking here about a mother who is the primary caregiver. The attachment to the mother occurs the earliest and is stronger and more consistent than attachments to other individuals. But the text points out that studies have shown that gender is really not the issue here. It is who is the primary caregiver. So, if for some reason a father is the primary caregiver for an infant, then that father may become the primary source of attachment for the infant, and will have a lot of influence on the infant. There's a direct relationship with brain development, as there is in so many of these areas, obviously. Think back to the studies I'm sure you heard about, infants that were reared in orphanages and who maybe were picked up a few times a day to have their diaper changed and be given a bottle, but really weren't cuddled and interacted with normally. They just didn't have the opportunity to form an attachment with a significant adult, and those infants grow up to have a great deal of difficulty in terms of their ability to connect with others and to interact with others. And the Harlow studies with monkeys, just to remind you of this, that comfort was more important to those monkeys than feeding. Right? Remember, they went to the rather than going to the monkey that had the wire monkey that had the bottle there for the infant to get fed. The baby rhesus monkeys, preferred the wire monkey with the towel wrapped around it because he could cuddle against that attachment. So very important. And I have read some articles years ago that suggested that 13 was this age that was so very important, that if a lot of the social skills of an individual, and I think this would include attachment, isn't developed by that age, that it's too late and can never be developed. But there are certainly indications that with the change in care and attachment qualities, a parent who's involved and engaged with the infant, that brain impairments that might develop with attachment could be reversed. There are others who believe the damage is permanent. This is one of those areas that is a nightmare for child protection workers when you're so focused on the infant, the parent-infant bond. If heaven forbid you have to remove an infant from a home, you have frequent and longer visits between the parent and the child than you can generally give other parents and their children. And this is all about attachment and all those kinds of things that go on in the mother-child relationship. It's so very important not to break that. But at the same time, the case scenario, I think, let's see, it was involving Chris Johnson and his infant Sarah. The CPS went in and removed the child very, very early because it was evident that the mother wasn't caring for the child and that the father was filling in and doing what he needed to do. There's just it's a debate, about that makes the job very difficult about just how quickly you remove a child, because you have to consider all these issues about attachment at this age. Play, another crucial part of child development that enhances, all the different aspects of the infant's development. And, it's really up to the parent to provide stimulation and opportunities for play. Now, there's many different ways, that the text kind of, one of the theorists in there gives you different ways, different things you can do for, depending upon the age in the first year, how you can facilitate that play and stimulate their brain development with play. But it points out here that, more and more now, children just a few months of age are using toys that are augmented by technology, and some of them are already dabbling with their parents' smartphones. I've seen it myself. Maybe not in the first year, but not much older than that. And the studies are showing that children are going to learn more quickly from a human being than from a screen. That's not a surprise, is it? I mean, and that if there's videos to watch where infants will stay attuned and engage with videos longer if an adult is or another human being is there watching with them and talking to them about it. The whole idea of putting a baby, and this is something else you see a lot in child protection visits, that the television becomes a babysitter, and it's just not that helpful at all for children. In fact, I forget what organization it is, but there's a pretty strong recommendation that children really not be exposed to television pretty much at all, or screens and things like this in the first 2 years of their life, that their brain is going to develop better if they have other ways of interacting. And there's an awful lot of parents who just are just ignoring that these days. Television can be a route to early language development in some areas where there aren't other resources, as this points out. And again, this is outside the infancy range, but I worked with a teenager when I was in Orlando who was born I think he was born in Honduras, if I remember correctly. Very adept at English, of course. By the time I met him, he was 16, perhaps. He had immigrated through San Diego, and his family came there, and his father still spoke very poor English years later, but David's English was perfect, and he said he started learning his language from watching Sesame Street. So it can be of some benefit. But, interaction between the parent and the infant, whether it's in a play or something like that, is very vital in cognitive development, and also is very good with helping the child to become developing a secure attachment. And I hope that we'll be talking about secure and insecure attachments later in the text. Also, the text points out that infants as early as 2 months of age respond to other infants in their environment, and and it's a vehicle for pure relationship development, even at this period of time. A few social and psychological factors that come up in terms of raising infants. One of them is this really applies a lot for working parents, but also other persons as well. Issues about family leave and paid child care. The United States has got probably the worst. I think they do have the worst. We have the worst parental leave program of any developed nation in the world. And in fact, it's worse than many rather poorly developed nations in the world. We are the only affluent country in the world that does not offer at least some paid parental leave at the time of a birth or an adoption. And, under the Family Medical Leave Act, and in most countries, adoption of a child has to be treated the same way as of a birth of a child. So in the U.S., the Family Medical Leave Act guarantees that this says 12 hours, and it should be 12 weeks. That would be terrible, terrible leave. I'll fix that before I publish this slide. 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year per parent. So most countries do this as well. In the United States, the father is guaranteed the same amount of family leave as the mother. And so I knew a couple that the mother took 12 weeks after the baby came home, and the father took the next 12 weeks of leave, and so that together they were with the infant almost a whole half year before the baby had to go into daycare. So, but there are so many restrictions on FEMLA, and we talked about this in an earlier chapter. I mean, it just it's restricted to companies with 50 or more employees, and they have to be within so many miles radius of the company's headquarters or something like that. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. If you have an agency where you accumulate paid leave, most of those agencies, I believe, or most of those organizations will let you use that leave as a part of your family medical leave or whatever. But beyond that, there's no guarantee of payment. But what it does guarantee is that your position will be held for you by law while you take time off to be with your infant or newly adopted child. But there's a chart, I believe, somewhere else in the book we looked at already that shows you just how most all nations in the world have paid leave offered, in some of them for as much as a year or more. And so we have a long way to go in this area. And this reflects our values. And the economy, the dollar, money comes before any consideration about healthy human development and supporting families, unlike other developed nations in the world. Childcare, much the same. The text talks about the European model, where there is universal childcare for all children, regardless of a parent's income. In the United States, only 1 in 6 eligible low-income families get any kind of federal child care assistance. And so 5 out of 6 low-income families aren't accessing daycare assistance, even though they might be eligible. Many advocates for infant daycare think that the European model is the ideal for the United States. The lack of affordable and quality daycare is a major consideration for parents, particularly those that are, being pushed to get off of public assistance. Do we breastfeed or bottle feed? That's another one of these discussions and debates, I guess, around the world. The attitudes really changed since the 1980s. It's shifted back in favor of breastfeeding. The AAP, and I forget what that stands for, but the AAP recommends that infants be breastfed for at least the first 6 months, and only for the only breastfed human milk. And followed by continued breastfeeding with some supplementary use of foods until the infant is at least 1 year of age. And there's a lot of I think a lot of good physical reasons for that, involving the infant developing antibodies and different kind of things, from the mother's breast milk that they don't get through being bottle fed. And yet, I think there's still if I remember the statistics in the text, the majority of parents stop breastfeeding not long after the birth of the baby, even if they breastfed initially. And this is one of these things where culture and social customs all come into play to either support or discourage breastfeeding. This is an issue in the work site. A lot of mothers, a lot of work sites won't allow breastfeeding in the work site. Others do. It's one of those social discussions that we encounter. Just a brief mention of postpartum depression here. Probably should have more about this here, but this is something that is often overlooked. And 10 to 15% of mothers have postpartum depression in the first year of the infant's life. This is the text says this is different from the baby blues, but this is a longer term, ongoing depression that can really impact the mother's psychological life and has an impact on the marital relationship if it's a two-parent home, and create some relationship difficulties there, and can really obviously have an impact upon the environment that the infant is raised in. So this is something that as we interact with young mothers or new mothers, we should always be screening for postpartum depression. So just kind of as an overview, nutrition during fetal life is a key factor in later chronic disease. Having adequate nutrition really kind of helps to guard against chronic disease. But infant mortality is mentioned here, and perhaps the most disturbing discussion here in this is the infant mortality rate. Infant mortality involves the death of a child before his or her first birthday. And although the infant mortality rate tends to be the highest in impoverished countries, and that's not a surprise, although we are you notice I didn't say advanced social development. Despite our social and advanced economic development, the United States has a relatively high rate of infant mortality. And this is more so the case among minority populations and among those persons in lower socioeconomic groups. I mentioned this in an earlier talk. The three factors that have negative consequences for the infant's immediate development are poverty in the infant's environment, inadequate caregiving, and child maltreatment in infancy. Key protective factors for the infant: family life education, social and economic support, a very vital thing that our society begrudgingly hands over, if that, and maternal education. And understand, family life education and maternal education are what really kind of fall into categories that we call prevention in the field, and prevention programs are the first social programs to be cut. First programs to be cut in any budget cutting round, and this is something that is one of those things as social workers we need to continue to advocate to restore or to keep when budget discussions are underway. According to the Center for Disease Control, despite recent declines in infant mortality, the U.S. ranked 26th among 29 OECD countries, and this is the OECD is the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, I believe, is what it stands for. Mostly they're wealthier nations, not entirely, but we're 26th out of 29 OECD countries in 2010. I think we're a little the infant mortality rate fell by 1% since then, but still it's too high. And we're behind most European countries, as well as behind Japan, Korea, Israel, Australia, and New Zealand. The last chart I looked at, we had the same infant mortality rate as Bosnia-Herzegovina, parts of former Czechoslovakia, an ex-communist country. So our infant mortality rate of 6.1 infant deaths per 1,000 live births was, I think it's 5.8 now, 5.3, was more than twice the rate for Japan and Finland, the countries with the lowest rates. 21 of the 26 OECD countries studied had infant mortality rates below 5.0. So this pattern of high infant mortality rates in the U.S., when compared with other developed countries, has persisted for many years. So this is another one of the things that we can feel shame about. So what's this mean for our practice here? We have a few more slides and we'll be done. When you work with clients of childbearing age, both females and males, always consider the possibility of conception, pregnancy, and childbirth and their potential outcomes and their impact upon the changing person and environmental configuration. Going back to the discussion about the couple of slides that I put in about FASD, this includes finding out as your relationship develops with your client, are you sexually active? And if you're sexually active, are you using some sort of contraceptive to prevent contraception? And if not, are you drinking? Those kinds of things. And I'll add to this because it's an issue in Alaska these days, about marijuana, which the recreational marijuana use is now legal, and you would know better than I as to whether this has increased use of marijuana or not in the state. But there are very, very few studies that talk about the effect of smoking marijuana upon the developing fetus. And advocates for legalization will tell you there's nothing to suggest that it's harmful to the fetus. And my response to that would be there's nothing to suggest it because it hasn't been studied enough. And so I don't know why that is, but there's just so little information about that. So that's just another factor to consider. And when you're talking with young families, identify the needs of vulnerable and at-risk groups and work to provide services for them. This is in particular talking about birth education classes, interpreters for hearing impaired, those kinds of things. Be proactive when working with at-risk populations to limit undesirable reproductive outcomes and to help meet their reproductive needs. This includes things like at-risk groups. Again, these are prevention programs, so maybe find another way to call them at-risk groups. That's a term that maybe the politicians will buy into. Low-income women involved with substance abuse, with eating disorders, with disabilities, women who lack financial, social services, those kinds of things. Collaborate with other professionals. So it's something you're going to do whether you want to or not if you're going to be an effective social worker. Be acquainted with the theories and empirical research about growth and development around infants or among infants. And of course, this is why we go through these slides, just to remind you, if nothing else. There's always new information out there. And even if it's something that, you think you know all about, but you haven't really read up on it lately, you're going to find new information, new studies when you go back through this old material. So don't ever think you've got it down. Always be willing to study more. Assess infants in the context of their environment, their culture included in that, so that sometimes developmental milestones are reached differently. Parenting techniques are handled differently sometimes, as long as it's not abusive, then try to be respectful of cultural preferences. And in particular for work in Alaska, be familiar with those traditional child caring preferences. Promote the continued use of formal and informal social support networks for parents with infants. And Alaska, the definition of an extended family, fictive kin, is what was called earlier, is much broader than it is in many. So when we talk about aunts and uncles or aunties and uncles, those individuals can be very significant in the lives of children, even if they're not immediately related. Advocate for more affordable, better quality childcare and provide interventions to parents to facilitate effective caregiving for infants. Help parents understand the potential effects of inadequate caregiving, and in particular, perhaps, and effects on brain development. In Alaska, again, I'll say the importance of education about the impact of alcohol on the developing fetus just can't be overestimated. It just cannot be overestimated. It's very vital. Finally, help parents and others understand the association between infant development and the consequential outcomes across the life course. It isn't just about keeping this baby kind of fat and happy now. It's got all the implications for infant. This is the foundation, the basic building blocks of that person's life for years and years to come. Okay, that's all for Chapter 11. Hope that there was some useful information in here for you, and I'll see you in the next chapter.